All 4 engines died at once. No power. No warning. Just silence, 3,000 feet above the runway, with 487 lives on board. The pilot fought for control. But the real hero wasn't in the cockpit, she was crawling through the dark cargo hold, risking her life to save everyone else's. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was a warm afternoon in October. The sky over Miami was clear and blue, with only a few small clouds far away near the sea. Inside the cabin of Sky Pacific Flight 287, coming in from San Francisco, everything felt normal. People were closing their laptops. A baby was asleep in row 20. A flight attendant was collecting the last of the coffee cups. In seat 14C, next to the window, sat a woman named Dr. Isabel Rossi. She was 46 years old, with dark hair and a few streaks of gray near her temples. On her lap was a leather folder. Inside it were pages of notes, graphs, and diagrams. On the cover, in small neat letters, someone had written, "Crash Dynamics Analysis." Isabel was not a pilot. She was not a flight attendant. She was an engineer who studied how planes fail. For almost 20 years, she had looked closely at plane crashes from all over the world, not to feel sad about them, though she often did, but to understand them. She wanted to know the small, quiet reasons why a safe machine suddenly became a deadly one. A loose bolt. A cracked pipe. A computer that gave the wrong reading at the wrong second. She had studied more than 100 crashes in her career. She knew the patterns. She knew that most accidents were never caused by one single big mistake. They were caused by many small mistakes lining up together, like dominoes falling one after another. There was one danger that worried her more than any other. She had written papers about it. She had explained it to safety boards. She had once stood in front of a group of government officials and told them, as clearly as she could, that some large passenger planes had a hidden weakness in their fuel systems. If dirty fuel with water or rust or the wrong chemicals in it, ever got into the shared fuel lines, it could spread to every engine on the plane at the same time. Not one engine failing. Not two. All of them, together, in the same few seconds. The officials had listened politely. They had thanked her. And then they had done nothing. Fixing the fuel systems on every plane that used this design would cost a huge amount of money. The airlines said the chance of it happening was too small to worry about. Very unlikely, they called it. Not a priority. Isabel had learned to live with that answer, even though it never felt right to her. She kept working. She kept writing papers that few people read. She had a small office at home filled with binders of old accident reports, each one a story of ordinary people who had boarded a plane expecting nothing more than a normal flight. She often told her students, at the university where she sometimes taught a night class, that a crash was never really about one broken part. It was about all the small warnings that got ignored along the way, one after another, until the warnings ran out and only the accident was left. She thought about that a lot on quiet nights. She thought about how strange it was that her whole career was built on studying disasters that had already happened, disasters that could not be stopped anymore, only understood. She sometimes wondered what it would feel like to be inside one instead of reading about it afterward from a safe office chair. She never expected to find out. Today, she was flying to Miami to give a talk at a safety conference. It was the same conversation she had given many times before, in many cities, to smaller and smaller audiences each year. She had grown a little tired of it, if she was honest with herself, tired of speaking clearly and being heard politely and changing nothing. But she still believed the work mattered, even if no one else seemed to. She looked out the window at the clouds passing below the wing, opened her folder, and reviewed her notes one more time, not knowing that in a few minutes, the disaster she had spent her whole career studying was about to happen to her, on this exact plane, 3,000 feet above the ground. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Torres was talking to Miami Air Traffic Control. He was 58 years old, with more than 20,000 hours of flying behind him. Sitting beside him was First Officer Diana Santos, calm and sharp, watching the instrument panel the way she always did, carefully, without missing a detail. Miami approach, Flight 287, Michael said into his headset. We are showing some unusual engine numbers. Give us a moment. He looked at the screen in front of him. Something was wrong with the fuel pressure reading on engine 1. He checked engine 2. The same strange drop was happening there too. Diana leaned forward. Captain, we're losing pressure on all 4 engines. That shouldn't be possible. For a second, Michael's mind went back to a training class he had once attended, years ago, about a rare kind of failure, a shared fuel line problem that could, in theory, hit every engine on a wide-body jet at once. He remembered thinking, at the time, that it sounded almost too strange to be real. It was real. Engine 1 lost power first. A few seconds later, engine 2 went quiet. Then 3 and 4 followed, almost together. In the space of less than 10 seconds, a 500-ton aircraft carrying 487 people had become a giant glider, silently falling through the sky above one of the busiest airports in the country. Mayday, 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 Michael said, his voice steady even though his heart was pounding. Sky Pacific 287. We have lost all 4 engines. We are gliding toward Miami International. We need every runway clear, right now. The voice from the tower answered quickly. 287, copy, all engines out. Say your altitude and rate of descent. 3,000 feet. Coming down at 1,200 feet per minute. We are going to try for runway 08 right. But even as he said the words, Michael was doing the math in his head, and the math did not work. At that speed and that height, the plane would run out of altitude long before it reached the runway. They were too high, moving too fast, and they had no engines left to slow themselves down or climb back up. In the cabin, passengers felt the strange silence that comes when engine noise disappears. A few people looked at each other, unsure if something was wrong or if it was just part of a normal landing. Then the intercom clicked on. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are dealing with a technical problem and will be making an emergency approach into Miami. Please listen carefully to the flight attendants and follow all instructions. What the passengers did not know, but what Michael understood with complete certainty, was that, as things stood, there was a very real chance this plane was about to crash. Diana ran through the checklist for engine restart anyway, because that was what training told her to do, even when a part of her already knew it would not work. She flipped switches. She checked igniters. She watched the numbers on her screen, hoping to see even one engine flicker back to life. Nothing happened. The engine stayed dark and silent, for dead weights hanging under the wings of a plane that was still moving forward at over 200 miles an hour, simply because it had nowhere else to go but down. Fuel flow to all 4 engines is at 0, Diana said, her voice tight but controlled. Backup pumps aren't helping. I don't understand how backup is showing the same failure as primary. Michael did not answer right away. He was busy fighting the controls, trying to keep the big aircraft steady as it slowed and dropped without the push of any engine behind it. A plane without power did not fall out of the sky like a stone, it could still glide, still be steered, still be flown, just without the ability to climb, or speed up, or correct a mistake by adding more power. Every choice from here on had to be exactly right the first time, because there would be no second chances. In the cabin, the strange quiet did not last long. A man near the front noticed the engine sound was gone and said something to the woman next to him. A child asked her mother why the plane felt like it was floating. Word passed slowly from row to row, the way fear always does on a plane, not in a scream, but in a whisper that grows heavier the further it travels. By the time the captain's announcement came over the speakers, some passengers were already gripping the armrests so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, repeating instructions in calm, practiced voices, even though their own hearts were pounding as hard as anyone else's. Margaret walked the length of the cabin twice, checking seatbelts, checking tray tables, offering steady eye contact to anyone who looked close to panic, because she knew that in moments like this, a calm face could sometimes do more good than any set of instructions. Isabel felt it before the announcement even started. She felt the small shift in the plane's balance, the change in the sound of the wind outside her window, the strange stillness where engine noise should have been. Her whole body went cold, because she recognized the feeling. She had read about it in accident reports 100 times. She had never expected to feel it herself. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, even as a flight attendant asked passengers to stay seated. She walked quickly toward the front of the plane. A flight attendant named Margaret, a calm woman in her 50s who had flown for almost 30 years, stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We are in an emergency." "I know we are," Isabel said. "That's why I need to speak to the captain. Right now. It's important, I study exactly this kind of failure." Something in the way she said it, steady, certain, without any panic, made Margaret pause. She looked at Isabel for a second longer, then turned and knocked on the cockpit door. When the door opened, Isabel did not waste time with introductions. "You have contaminated fuel spreading through the cross-feed system to all 4 engines," she said. "Switching tanks will not help. Your backup fuel is likely just as bad as the main supply." Michael turned his head sharply. "Who are you?" "Dr. Isabel Rossi. I'm an aircraft crash engineer. I have studied this exact type of failure for years. This is not a normal engine problem. This is a fuel system problem, and it explains why all 4 engines failed at almost the same moment." Diana and Michael looked at each other. There was no time to question how she knew, only time to ask what to do next. "What's the fix?" Michael asked. Isabel's answer was the hardest thing she had ever had to say out loud. "There isn't a normal one," she said. "You cannot glide this plane down safely onto a runway from this height, at this speed, with no engines. The distance and the numbers don't match. You will run out of altitude before you can slow down enough to land the way you want to." "So we crash," Diana said quietly. "Yes," Isabel answered. "But there is a difference between an uncontrolled crash and a controlled one. If you can reach open water instead of the runway, and bring the plane down at the right angle, at a slower forward speed, you have a real chance of keeping the body of the plane in one piece. Instead of losing most of the people on board, you could save most of them." Michael's jaw tightened. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough to tell you," Isabel said. "A safe landing on the runway, in my judgment, is close to impossible from here. A controlled descent into calm water gives you a real chance, not a guarantee, but a real chance, of keeping this plane together." It was, in its own strange way, the only piece of good news left. The unthinkable choice, deliberately steering a huge passenger plane away from land and into the sea, had suddenly become the safest option they had. Michael had less than 2 minutes to make the biggest decision of his career. "If we try for the runway," he asked, "what happens?" "You come in far too fast," Isabel said. "The plane overshoots the runway. It hits buildings, fences, or ground equipment at high speed. The body of the plane likely breaks apart. Fuel catches fire. Most people do not survive. And the water? If you bring the nose up slightly before impact, 12 to 15 degrees, the belly of the plane meets the water at an angle instead of straight on. Water slows the plane down more gently than concrete does. There is a real chance the fuselage stays whole. Some passengers will be badly hurt. But most people can survive, if the plane holds together and evacuation goes smoothly." Diana was already looking at her charts. "If we aim for Biscayne Bay, the water there is calm and flat today. It's close enough to reach, and rescue boats can get to us fast." Michael made his choice. He pressed the intercom button. "This is the captain. We are not going to attempt a runway landing. We are preparing for a controlled water landing in Biscayne Bay. Flight attendants, begin emergency briefing immediately. Everyone, listen closely and follow every instruction. But there was one more problem, and Isabel had only just realized it. There's something else, she said quickly. The valve that is supposed to automatically shut off the fuel line between engines, the one that should stop the contamination from spreading further, it clearly hasn't worked. That means the bad fuel is still connected between both fuel systems. If the tanks rupture on impact, that contaminated fuel could spread through more of the aircraft than it should. That raises the risk of fire after we land in the water. How do we fix that? Michael asked. There's a manual valve, Isabel said. In the lower cargo hold. Someone has to physically get down there, find it, and turn it by hand to close off the line before we hit the water. Diana's face went pale. That area takes the worst of the impact. Whoever goes down there might not make it back up in time. The cockpit went silent for a moment. Then Isabel said, quietly but without hesitation, I know exactly where that valve is. I've studied the diagrams for years. I'll go. The plane was now down to 1,200 feet, gliding steadily toward the calm, glittering water of Biscayne Bay. Michael had already alerted every plane and boat in the area. Coast Guard cutters were speeding toward the bay. Rescue helicopters were being called into the air. Isabel had about 3 minutes to do something that was not supposed to be possible. Margaret led her to a small hatch near the galley, a narrow opening with a ladder leading down into the belly of the aircraft, the cargo hold. If you're not back up here in 2 minutes, Margaret said, gripping her arm for a moment, we have to close this hatch. When we hit the water, if it's open, it could tear this part of the plane apart. Isabel nodded and climbed down. The cargo hold was dark, cold, and cramped, packed with suitcases and metal cargo containers. The sound of rushing wind outside was much louder here, closer to the metal skin of the plane, closer to whatever was about to happen. Isabel switched on a small flashlight and moved toward the fuel system panel at the back of the hold. She knew the layout from memory, she had studied diagrams like this one more times than she could count. But knowing a diagram on paper and finding a small metal handle in a dark, shaking cargo hold with less than 2 minutes left were two very different things. She found the valve. It was stuck. She wrapped both hands around the handle and pulled with all the strength she had. It did not move. Outside, the wind was growing louder. The plane was getting lower. She guessed they had less than a minute before impact. She pulled again, bracing her feet against a cargo container, using her whole body this time, not just her arms. The handle groaned. Old, corroded metal slowly began to turn. She pulled once more, gritting her teeth, and felt the valve give way. It rotated fully. The fuel line was now closed off. The contaminated fuel could no longer spread between the two systems. She had done what she came to do. But now she had only seconds left to climb back up the ladder and reach the cabin before impact, and the ladder suddenly felt much longer than it had a few minutes ago. Her legs were shaking from effort and fear. She grabbed the rails and climbed as fast as she had ever climbed anything in her life. She was almost at the top, almost within reach of the hatch, when the plane hit the water. The impact was violent, but it was controlled, exactly the kind of landing Michael and Diana had worked to create. The plane struck the surface of Biscayne Bay at a slightly nose-up angle, just as Isabel had described. The water, thick and heavy, acted like a giant cushion instead of a wall. The fuselage shook hard, throwing loose items and unsecured people forward, but it stayed in one piece. Passengers screamed and gripped their armrests as the plane skidded and slowed across the water. Spray came up around the windows in huge white sheets. And then, after what felt like forever but was really only a few seconds, the plane came to a stop, floating and rocking gently on the surface of the bay. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then Margaret's voice rang out, strong and clear, everyone, unbuckle now. Leave your bags. Move to the exits. Emergency slides opened automatically at the doors, turning into rafts on the water. Passengers began climbing out, helping each other, some crying, some silent with shock, all moving as fast as they could toward the exits. In the cargo hold, Isabel had been thrown hard against a metal container by the force of the impact. She felt sharp pain in her ribs and her shoulder, and for a moment, everything went dark around the edges of her vision. But she was alive. She forced herself to move, to crawl toward the ladder, to climb, slowly this time, up toward the light coming through the open hatch above her. Rescue crews reached the plane within minutes. Coast Guard boats pulled alongside, and swimmers helped passengers into life rafts. Helicopters hovered overhead, lowering baskets for those who needed them most. Paramedics found Isabel near the bottom of the ladder, bleeding from a cut above her eye, her arm held awkwardly against her side, but conscious. "What's your name?" a young medic asked as they lifted her carefully onto a stretcher. "Isabel Rossi," she managed to say. "The valve, did it hold? Did the fuel stay isolated?" The medic looked confused for a second, then radioed the question forward. A few minutes later, word came back: no fire, no fuel spread, the aircraft had stayed intact exactly as she had hoped. Of the 487 people who had boarded that flight in San Francisco, 483 made it out of the water alive. There were injuries, broken bones, cuts, shock, but the disaster that could have taken hundreds of lives had, in the end, taken far fewer than anyone had feared when those 4 engines first went silent. News helicopters arrived within the hour, circling above the bay, filming the half-sunken shape of the aircraft still floating near the shoreline, surrounded by small boats and orange life rafts. By evening, footage of the water landing was playing on every news channel in the country. Reporters described it as one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. Captain Torres was shown briefly, wrapped in a blanket on the deck of a rescue boat, being thanked by a Coast Guard officer. Passengers, still soaked and shaking, told reporters how calm the crew had been, how quickly the doors had opened, how the water had felt strangely warm as they swam toward the rescue boats. Almost no one mentioned the cargo hold. Almost no one asked what had happened deep inside the aircraft, below the passenger cabin, in the minutes before impact. For that night, at least, the story the world heard was a simpler one: a skilled pilot, a lucky landing, and hundreds of grateful survivors. Isabel, resting in a hospital bed with a bandage above her eye and her arm in a sling, watched the news coverage in silence and said nothing to the nurse checking her blood pressure. She was too tired, and too sore, to explain. In the weeks that followed, investigators from the Aviation Safety Board studied every second of the flight. They studied the fuel contamination. They studied the captain's decision to aim for the water instead of the runway. And, for the first time in the board's history, they had to study something else entirely: the actions of a passenger who had left her seat, entered a restricted part of the aircraft, and operated an aircraft system without any authorization to do so. Isabel was interviewed for many hours. "You entered a restricted area during an emergency," one investigator, a serious man named Thomas Richardson, told her. "You operated aircraft equipment without clearance from the flight crew. Under normal rules, that's a serious violation." "The plane was heading toward an uncontrolled crash," Isabel answered. "What I did helped turn it into a controlled one. 483 people are alive because of what happened in that cargo hold." "But you made that decision yourself," Richardson said. "You didn't wait for full approval. You acted on your own judgment." "Yes," Isabel said simply. "I did." "Do you understand what it means if we say that was acceptable?" he pressed. "It means any passenger who believes they know better than the crew could try to take action during a crisis. That's a dangerous idea for aviation safety." Isabel looked at him steadily. "And if passengers with real expertise are never allowed to help, even when their help is the only thing standing between survival and disaster, then people die who didn't have to. I'm not saying every passenger should act. I'm saying that on that day, in that specific moment, doing nothing was worse than doing something. The debate did not stay quiet for long. It spread from the safety board to the news, and then to government hearings. Some officials argued that Isabel had broken important rules and that her actions, however lucky the outcome, could not be allowed to set an example. Others argued that she had saved hundreds of lives and deserved recognition, not criticism. Still others pointed out an uncomfortable truth, that Isabel had warned officials about this exact kind of fuel system danger years earlier, and nothing had been done about it. When she was called to speak before a government committee, Isabel did not hold back. 5 years ago, I explained this risk in detail, she said. I gave the numbers. I gave the research. I was told it was unlikely, that fixing it would cost too much, that it wasn't worth the investment. It happened anyway. And when it happened, the only person on that aircraft who understood how to respond was someone whose warnings had already been ignored once. The room was quiet after she finished speaking. In the end, the safety board decided not to bring any formal charges against her. But they also chose not to officially credit her role in the outcome. Public statements from the airline and the government focused almost entirely on the skill and calm decision-making of the flight crew during the emergency landing. Isabel's name appeared only briefly, described as a passenger who assisted crew members, with no mention of the cargo hold, the valve, or the risk she had taken. Captain Torres tried, more than once, to correct the record. In interviews, he spoke openly about Isabel's warning in the cockpit and her decision to go below. She's the reason that landing worked the way it did, he told one reporter. I flew the plane down. She's the reason it stayed in one piece when it got there. A few newspapers printed his comments. Most left them out, because the simpler story, a hero pilot, a miracle landing, was easier to tell in a few short lines than the harder truth about a passenger who had broken the rules and turned out to be right. Diana, too, spoke up in the following months, testifying that without Isabel's information about the fuel system, the crew would have wasted valuable time trying to restart engines that could never have restarted, and might have chosen the runway instead of the water, with far worse results. Her testimony was recorded in the official file. It did not change the airline's public statements. For a while, Isabel received letters, some from passengers who had been on the flight, thanking her quietly, privately, in ways the official record never would, a few from other engineers who had read her old papers and finally understood, too late for it to matter to the rulebook, that she had been right all along. She kept every letter in a drawer in her desk, next to the folder marked Crash Dynamics Analysis, as if they were proof of something the world had decided not to write down. Months later, Isabel sat at the small desk in her apartment in Miami. Her ribs had healed. Her shoulder still ached sometimes when the weather changed, a quiet reminder of that afternoon over Biscayne Bay. On the desk in front of her was a blank page and a new folder, much like the one she had carried onto the plane that day. She was writing again. This time, the paper was not only about how planes fail. It was about what happens after, about the strange, uncomfortable space between doing the right thing and being allowed to admit you did it. She thought about all the passengers who had climbed off that plane and back into their lives, the woman who had been holding her sleeping baby, the businessman in seat 22A who had cried quietly with relief once his feet touched dry land, the flight attendants who had stayed calm through the whole thing and guided hundreds of frightened people to safety. She thought about the 2 crew members who had not made it, and the 1 crew member who died trying to help a child. She thought about how easily this story could have ended with far more names on that list, if a valve in a dark cargo hold had stayed stuck for just a few more seconds. She wondered, sometimes, late at night, whether she had been right to make that choice on her own, to climb down into danger without asking anyone's permission first, to decide, in the space of a single breath, that her judgment was worth trusting with so many lives. She had no perfect answer to that question. She doubted she ever would. But she had an answer that felt true enough to live with. It was necessary. And on the worst day of her life, when there was no time left for meetings, or committees, or careful approval, necessity was the closest thing to certainty she had. She finished the first page of her new paper and kept writing. She knew that most of the people with the power to change the rules would probably read it, nod politely, and set it aside, just as they had done with her last warning. She knew her name would likely stay out of the official record. She knew there was a good chance that, years from now, this whole event would be remembered as a story about a skilled pilot's smart choices, with no mention of the woman who had gone into the dark to make those choices survivable at all. She wrote anyway. Because somewhere, on some other flight, another person might be sitting quietly in seat 14C, carrying knowledge that no one around them had, waiting, without knowing it yet, for the moment when that knowledge would matter more than anything else in the world. And when that moment came, Isabel hoped, there would be one more page written somewhere that told them, it is possible to act. It is possible to help. Even when no one gives you permission. Even when no one thanks you afterward. Sometimes, doing the right thing does not come with credit. Sometimes, it only comes with the quiet knowledge that, because of what you did, someone else got to go home.